Welcome. I'm Mark Lawson, president of MorningStar Music Publishers. We're very pleased to be able to present this session for the Hymn Society that was supposed to be in Atlanta, Georgia, on the campus of Emory University, but we are in, obviously, our home offices and in our homes. Today, we are going to present the session in which we talk with Dr. Eric Nelson about many of his wonderful hymn arrangements. Dr. Nelson is the Director of Choral Studies at Emory University and has served as Artistic Director of the Atlanta Master Chorale since 1999. Dr. Nelson is not only known for his wonderful conducting, but he's also known for his hymn arrangements that are sung literally around the country. And so we're going to talk a little about that arranging and about what makes a good hymn arrangement. So welcome, Eric. I know that we were supposed to be on your campus, so I'm imagining it being very hot, but enjoying a lot of Southern hospitality.
It is great to see you through this medium. It is actually a beautiful day in Atlanta today. We do occasionally, some years, have a spring, and this is one of those years.
We'll discuss your background a little bit and what kind of hymns that you experienced growing up, and then maybe a little bit about how that influences what you choose to arrange.
I grew up in the church and also was trained from a fairly young age as an organist. And both of those things, I think, play into my fondness for arranging hymns. My childhood church experiences, I grew up in one of those families that we used to say that if the lights were on, we were there. And on Sunday morning, there were the grand hymns with the organ, the "O for a Thousand Tongues" and "A Mighty Fortress" and "All Creatures of Our God and King" type hymns. And then we'd be back on Sunday night. And on Sunday night, there was no use of the organ. It was piano and a song leader and maybe a gospel quartet. And everything would be a little bit more of the gospel variety, the foot tapping variety, revival hymns, and such. And they were all just hymns to me as I was growing up. I didn't really parse the difference until years later. And then as an organist, you begin to get to the point where you're doing Bach choral preludes, which are really just hymn arrangements, aren't they? With tunes that for the most part we don't know anymore, so they seem a little bit more exotic. But that idea of taking a pre-existent melody, a cantus firmus, and reimagining it, resetting it in a way that gives it new life is something that's, very much deep into my DNA as a musician and probably just as a person. In terms of which hymns I choose to set, I do think that it is that earlier experience of Sunday morning and Sunday night hymns. That the Sunday morning hymns, the grand hymns, the hymns that are part of the canon are wonderful to put my own stamp on, especially if there's kind of an occasion in which someone wants to do that hymn and it falls to me to kind of do a fresh setting of it. But I realized a number of years ago that the Sunday night hymns had, if we're not careful, can be seen as a bit cliched maybe, or something that isn't classical enough or artsy enough, or I don't know what term you want to put on it.
Maybe overly familiar in a way.
Maybe. My mother, who died at the age of 97, was a musician by ear, not trained, but sang and played the piano by ear. And she came to one of my recitals once. I can't remember now whether it was a recital or a choir concert, but it was one I was very proud of and was very happy that she was able to come. And afterwards, I asked her what she thought. And it was filled with, Renaissance music and Baroque music and things from all the periods, as choir concerts often are. And she was very non-committal at the end and kind of smirked a little bit. And I said, "How was it?" She said, "Well, it was okay, I guess." And I looked at her, hoping for a little bit more information, I guess. And she said, I just don't understand why you don't do the old hymns. And I said, Mom, we did music from the 1600s. And she said, oh, you know what I mean. And I did know what she meant. For her, the old hymns were the hymns of her youth, the heart songs, the hymns that touched her, and probably more Sunday night hymns than Sunday morning hymns. And so when I've gotten the chance, and certainly I intend to continue to do so, I'm taking a look at some of those hymns that maybe have fallen out of use in big steepled churches with beautiful pipe organs and stained glass windows, and find a way to bring them back into the canon, or at least have people look at them again in a fresh way. I just think that they express in a very particular and important way humanity's relationship to God.
Right. Yeah, and I think that one of the unique things about that is that you have arranged many of these to be sung with the Atlanta Master Chorale, but you didn't always have the Atlanta Master Chorale in mind when you wrote them. I think that you've written them for some church choirs, and you've written them some for the Atlanta Master Chorale. Do you envision a choir when you put these together? Do you have a particular group in mind that you're writing for when you're doing this, or are you pretty much reveling in what you feel are the beauty of that particular hymn?
Yes and yes. So certainly my main guide is the hymn itself, the interrelation between the tune and the text, and whatever kind of implications that are needed, that I'm hoping to bring out from verse to verse and moment to moment. And I have a particular sound that choirs make, and certainly I have that in my ear. It'd be a discussion for another day of which comes first. The sound of Master Chorale, am I hearing that in my ear, or is it because I have that sound in my ear that Master Chorale sounds the way they do? That's another conversation. But I think the constraints are in commissions from smaller churches in particular, are just being careful not to get too carried away in divisions. If it's a modestly sized church choir, you don't want to write for 6-part men. You might not want the tenor part to go too high for too long, and that sort of a thing. So it's not so much the sound being made as I hesitate to use the word limitations because that seems negative, but the constraints that are put on by the place itself. Right. Sometimes the very nature of the commission will add to the beauty of the piece itself. Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, for instance, was a commission from a church who had 2 congregants who were wonderful instrumentalists. One played the flute, one played the cello. So he said, would you write us a hymn arrangement that involves a flute and a cello? And so, yes. Right. And so I wonder sometimes, some pieces turn out well, and I'm happy that they exist. And I think sometimes of just the random serendipity of, if that ask had not happened, would that piece exist? Or would it exist in that way? It's an interesting thing to think about. Right.
So when I was in seminary, I'm just going to kind of segue into something here. When I was in seminary, one of my professors was, and a wonderful comment, and I think had something very important to say. He was saying, be careful about doing too many hymn arrangements, because you don't want to take some of the words away from the congregation. You want them to sing the things that they know. And so I kind of came out with that philosophy for a long time. And then I started realizing, though, that sometimes the congregation wants to sit back and hear it in a new, and sometimes listening to it is different than singing it. And I kind of hear that in your arrangements. I kind of hear you bringing out particular moments how do you feel about that? When you're doing these, do you feel that you're taking anything away from the congregation, or do you feel like you're adding another layer of meaning on top of that?
Oh, I think it's definitely the latter. I think that's a really good insight. And I think in the churches that are doing hymn arrangements of this sort, it's not like that means that they're not doing congregational hymns that morning. So
Right.
it's an addition for me. I also grew up in a church where it was pretty common that there'd be also a soloist or a duet or something during the morning as well. So there was always a mix of actively singing oneself and listening to someone singing to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's for me, it's definitely an enhancement.
Okay.
There is a thrill and a joy in hearing a piece newly composed that you've never heard before, maybe even on a text you've never heard before. And all of that kind of brings a jolt of new energy into the service and into your life. But there is also something wonderful about a new setting of a text that you know. Someone this week is writing a new setting of "Oh, Come, Let Us Sing to the Lord," right? Or the 23rd Psalm. It's going to be happening. Some hymns, some texts are just always going to find another setting of them, and that's a great thing.
Right.
But there is something, and I think it's what my mother was getting at. There is something about hearing something that is a tune and a text that you know, that goes, that doesn't need a filter. You know every word of it, and there's maybe implications. You remember singing it when you were younger. You remember singing it standing next to your grandmother, right? You remember that it was your sister's favorite hymn, all those sorts of things. You remember the first time you heard it, and the theological content in it is important to you and well known. And so I think hearing something like that come at you. So if it's the hymn version of that, then it's out of the hymnal, right? I mean, maybe the organist or pianist is filling around a little bit around the edges, but mostly you're just singing it the way it's written. And the arrangement can highlight some things. It can slow it down, speed it up, change the key. It can add a counter melody. It can change the harmony a little bit. It can linger on a thought. So I think the arrangement has the advantage of adding a craft and an artfulness to bring into more relief the very things that we loved about the hymn in the first place.
Yeah, and I've also wondered if congregations sometimes don't sing differently after they've heard a choir sing "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing" in a more flowing way rather than a strictly rhythmic way, for
Right.
example,
Right.
and then start feeling it differently,
Right.
actually.
Well, and it is certainly possible to sing with your whole heart and your whole mind. But it's also possible to sing in the same way it's possible to kind of recite the Lord's Prayer or the Creed. It's possible to just kind of go through the motions of singing along.
Right.
And certainly there are some people in a congregation who are kind of reluctant to sing out loud. They're a little nervous about their own voice for some strange reason. And so the arrangement again allows us to linger on thoughts and ideas and for them to free themselves up to really listen.
Yeah.
At least that's the hope.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, which I think is the first piece that we published in the Atlanta Master Chorale series. One of the things that you do in that particular arrangement is you're singing along with the Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, and then all of a sudden you bring in another thought from another hymn. And I don't think you've done that in a couple of different arrangements. And it's not a medley by any means. It's saying, oh, this hymn also seems to address this in a different way. Talk about that just a moment, about what you did there and what you were thinking.
Yeah, for those who don't know the hymn or the arrangement, I grew up singing "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms" on Sunday night as one of those peppy toe tapping songs. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. And it was when I looked at it again, I realized that past that first reference of joy, what a joy divine, that the rest of the text really was about the leaningness. It was comforting and gentle. And I also found the very idea of leaning was not so much a conversion. It wasn't a turning around and going another direction. It was just that kind of needing support of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so in slowing it down, I felt like the reflective nature of the text came through, even though I didn't change the melody at all. And then there was that moment, I think it's just before the last verse, where it says, "What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms." And in preparation for that moment of beginning the last verse, it occurred to me, for reasons that are certainly unknown to me, that fragment of Amazing Grace that says, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come." And so the men of the chorus sing that fragment as though to remind us that this thing that we might be worried about is not the first thing we've ever been worried about. And we've got through all the others. God's been faithful, and he'll be faithful again. And so it functions musically as a little bit of a moment that is unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
From, here comes another verse, here comes another verse.
Right, right.
And also kind of just lifts into that moment of faith in a way that I think we all experience when there is a little doubt, there is a little worry, and yet there's this moment that comes through song, through prayer, through counsel of a friend, where you kind of get a renewed swell of energy that moves you forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that one thing that I'm hearing is the fact that during this time, this particular time that we're all facing, a lot of this kind of hymn, this kind of music is what people are turning to think in terms of God's everlasting presence, God's steadfastness. So I think it's a good one for today, actually. Another one that's in the series that is actually not an old hymn, but a newer hymn, is your setting of When Memory Fades, which is the wonderful text by Mary Louise Bringle, and tune is Jane Southwick Cool. It's being sung, it was being sung in several different denominations. And you've made a very unique setting that has made, made its way around in so many different ways. Matter of fact, I'll say that 2 years ago, when we did a series of ACDA conferences, I was shocked that in every region, it was a public high school that sang your arrangement of this. And I've always thought of it as a prayer, and maybe that shouldn't be in schools, but it was obviously something that they were relating to and putting into their programs. Talk a little bit about how you discovered that and some of the feelings that went into your arrangement of that particular piece.
I heard Mary Louise Bringle, Mel Bringle, at a conference. I've forgotten now what conference, talking about her texts and her way of writing, probably similar to this, I suspect. And in that day, it was the first I had been introduced to the poem When Memory Fades. And I don't remember now whether it had just been written newly or whether she was being asked about it. But I remember her talking about part of the duties and responsibilities and mission of hymn writers, text hymn writers, was to try to plumb the depths of humans' relationship with God and theology and scripture, and find connections to daily life, modern life. How do we live our life in this world? And she was struck by how many of her friends were dealing with aspects of dementia, and that, as I remember her saying, she couldn't find anybody writing about it. And so she took it upon herself to find some framework in which, or for us, to consider dementia, Alzheimer's, in the context of God's love and our relationship to each other, and what happens when the ones that we love can't remember. And my goodness, it's just one of the most brilliant texts of our time. And in every way, as you consider that, God's love never changes, God remembers, that the works of the good work that was done by these people who now can't remember it are still there. Everything about it is, on one hand, tremendously comforting and just devastatingly difficult to ponder. And so I had been moved by hearing her talk about that, but I really just thought of it as words. And then the tune that Jane Southwick Cool wrote to go with it came across my desk. And I remember playing it through, and I wrote on the cover in capital letters and circled it, text. I have a little file of pieces that I come across where the music doesn't quite work for me, but the text is great. And that file for me is take a look at this later and see whether I might take a shot at it. And so I put it in that pile. And when I had the chance and the purpose to maybe do a setting of something related to Alzheimer's, I picked it up again and realized that I actually loved the tune and the way that the tune worked with the text, and really just wanted to find a setting that made it speak more clearly and directly. And that's what happened. And in this case, some tunes and texts need a little help from the arranger to kind of give them a little bit more interest and a little more energy, a little more complication, a little more art. This was one of those where the challenge was to heighten the effectiveness of tune and text while getting out of the way, to do it as simply as possible, to enhance without calling any attention to anything along the way.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about the ending. I think that's one of the striking moments of the piece.
So the tune itself begins, when memory fades and recognition falters. One of the things arrangers do, and I did in this case, is you take the beginning shape of a tune and then modify it a little bit to become the introduction. So the piano introduction begins da 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 dee, and then it kind of moves away into something else. And I use that as the introduction. It's of course baked into every phrase of the verses, and I use it as the interlude. So by the time the piece is over, we've heard that when memory fades and da dee da da dee, really all piece long. And so even if a listener, a congregant, or a member of the audience is hearing the piece for the very first time, by the time it gets to the end, that's familiar. They've learned it. They remember it. And so when it got to the end, just to demonstrate this idea of the very nature of the disease, that the thing that you knew you start to lose your grip on, you can't remember what comes next. I did that phrase again at the very end, and then repeated it with one less note, with a bit of a pause, as though we're trying to remember it, and then started back to the beginning of the phrase again with one less note. And then there was no, as there often is in arrangements, there was no final major chord. Just that searching for the next note that we can't remember is where we left it.
Yeah.
I hoped as an arranger that at least the conductor would notice that had happened. But I felt like that moment, that fragment felt right to me, even if the connection was not overtly made. It still felt right to me as an arranger. So if no one ever noticed, I was okay with that.
Well, I've heard the setting done a number of times with great choirs, your choir, the St. Olaf choir, many choirs. And I think that moment is quite special when it's done very well. And I remember your choir singing it in Minneapolis for the National ACDA convention, and how people lined up afterward, not only to thank you for the whole program, but how many had a particular story about that piece. And they felt that they wanted to say something to you about thanking you for that. And that meant a lot, just to see the reaction of people in that setting.
I think it's extraordinary. I think that maybe is an extreme example of what an arranger is trying to do in every arrangement, in every piece. Whether that is a reminder of a moment of theology, or a moment of joy, or a moment of poignancy. I think you're trying to bring out and enhance the very nature of what's embodied in that text and that tune and that harmonic mood, and just you're just trying to, and if people can experience the truth of that, the beauty of it again, that's as good as it gets. That's kind of our purpose.
talk a little bit about the whole idea of arranging hymns. And for those that are actually listening to this who want to do this themselves, you took a couple of real iconic hymns like How Great Thou Art and Silent Night, in which there are literally maybe 1,000 arrangements of those. I don't know. There are many. And you did something very unique with them. What would you say to an arranger about when you're looking at something that's been set many, many, many times? How do you look at that with fresh eyes without being affected by all the other settings that you've seen before?
That's a really good question. For me, and I hope this doesn't come across with some kind of implied arrogance, but for me, there's something that I'm looking for, searching for, hoping for, needing, that I can't find in those other settings. Mm-hmm. I may like them, I may have performed them, I may have done them, I may be very fond of them, but there's something about them that is not quite what I need or what I'm trying to get after. Mm-hmm. And then I will want to take a shot at it. There's sometimes external factors. In terms of Silent Night, the accompanist of Atlanta Master Chorale was very artful when playing simple exposed tunes, Brahms intermezzos, Chopin intermezzos, type things. And I was always very fond when she would do that thing. People who know Brahms and Chopin will know that there's very often they'll have a tune going, and then they'll play a note that's kind of in the middle register and then leap up a 12th or a 15th or an octave to a note that's higher. It's kind of a ka-tink, ka-tink. And I enjoyed that. And so it was for a particular Christmas concert, and I was needing a setting of Silent Night that I didn't find one that did exactly what I wanted. So I wrote this one and then included, I think unusually, the entire first verse, if I'm remembering my own arrangement correctly, the entire first verse is a fairly slow version of the entire Silent Night with the piano. It is. Mm-hmm. The choir just stands there and waits. And I don't know if somebody said, hey, would you do me an arrangement of Silent Night, that would have been what I would have done. But I did that to feature, that particular player. And then it turns out, of course, there's hundreds of players who love to do exactly that. Right. And I think the waiting, that slow presentation of Silent Night, often it's done at the candlelight portion of the Christmas concert near the end. And the quietness, the implied silence of waiting that long before the choir begins to sing, created something very special. In the terms of How Great Thou Art, my worry was that it would be dismissed as, oh, I'm not going to, I'm not even going to listen to the arrangement because we don't do that here. And so it was intentional that I did the arrangement not for piano, but for organ and brass quintet and timpani, right? It's the Vaughan Williams, oh, clap your hands kind of, feeling of Episcopal church kind of brass and organ. And I intentionally did that to kind of signal that I'm intending this hymn to be recast as a Sunday morning hymn. Mm-hmm. And so, and then you just roll up your sleeves and try to make it work.
I think it's interesting. Being a publisher, I see thousands of manuscripts every year, and many of the things that I receive are arrangements of things that have already been set. And so I know when I open that up and I look at it for the very first time, I say, okay, what is going to be different about this than anything I've seen before? What touches me in a new way that I haven't had, And I think your pieces do that. I can see that you think that way when you're crafting these. And I guess that would be what I would say is something that everyone who's wanting to set something is how is this different than what I've done before or has gone before?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And that's a very subtle thing, isn't it?
Yes.
Because you want to be fresh, but not for its own sake.
Right.
You want the melody to be recognizable. You want the harmonies to lift and move you from place to place without being off-putting, and it's a very difficult road, very tricky thing to make work.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I had a composition teacher in college, wonderful musician, wonderful composer. This was in the late 70s, and he would write very complicated hymn arrangements where you could barely recognize the tune at any point. You'd almost have to get in there with a magnifying glass and circle, oh, there's a D and there's a G, so that must be the fourth. And from an artistic standpoint, a creative standpoint, it was great stuff. We enjoyed kind of in college choir, kind of making them all work. But trying to find something that is achievable, singable, enjoyable, heartfelt, yet still fresh. Walking that line is really subjective, and I spend a lot of time trying to find, kind of in my own internal composition editing process.
Right.
Deciding that this verse, this setting of this verse needs a little help because it's too ordinary.
Right. Yeah.
Or that thing I did was really more about me showing off than actually helping the text. So I'm going to go back and simplify that out.
Right.
And certainly for young composers, there's some obvious things to always keep in mind, just adding variety to the ear. It's going from higher voices to lower voices, unison moments to parts, 2 parts soprano alto and 2 parts alto tenor for changes. Adding in 1 part, then 2 part, then 3 parts, then 4 parts. There's just so many things that you can do that are, I guess, stock things for people to do, but they really do make a difference. Every now and then, as a conductor looking for new music, something will come across my desk, and it'll just be the same thing for 5 verses. It's just there needs to be some journey in it.
Right. I'm going to kind of close with this because I know we're about out of time. But one thing I also think that's important in a hymn arrangement, and I think you do a very good job with this, is that when you do something that's based on a familiar hymn, the congregation has ownership. That it's like that's one of my hymns. I know that hymn. So they're in dialogue with you, even when you're singing, in a way that is different than if they'd never heard that piece before. And you've got an instant connection that you then kind of have to hold and keep, because they may be with you early and not stay with you. It's like, oh, well, he went off the rails there, so but I think that your pieces engage them deeply. And that's one thing I really greatly appreciate about the work that you've done. I feel like the congregation becomes more engaged in the piece as it goes along. And that's a gift.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That's a huge compliment and a beautifully put. I agree with that completely. There's always the hope that when the arrangement is finished and I send it over to you, that it will not only kind of work, be successful on some kind of intellectual musical craft level, though that is certainly part of it. But there's just the hope that there will be something in it, that somehow there'll be something that where the Spirit descends and inhabits it.
Yeah.
And I don't think that happens every time, but that's always the hope.
That's good. That's good. Well, thank you so much for visiting with us. And let me just tell people that if you'd like to explore things in the series, there are several ways to do it. There are wonderful videos on the Atlanta Master Chorale YouTube channel. We also have them, many of them, on our YouTube channel at MorningStar. Plus, you can also go to the MorningStar website, and if you choose to go into the choral section of the website, on the left-hand side, you can pull down a button called Series, Choral Series, and you can find all the pieces in the Atlanta Master Chorale series with one simple click. And so we invite you to explore those. So thank you very much, Eric, for taking time to visit with us, and we wish our very best for you as you get back to singing before too long.
Thank you. Stay well.
Okay. All right. Thank you.